I'll just say a couple of things up front. Obviously, I think it was a public fact some years ago that I was publicly agitating for this inquiry, and I think the committee suggested or requested that the Audit Office do it as a high priority, so thank you for exercising your discretion to do so. And I've also been, I'll just put it up front, I want to get two political things out the way so that we don't have a whole lot of politics through the hearing and we can focus on the substance. But I've also been a multi-year critic of the human impact, if you like, of what I've termed the maladministration of the family visa program, particularly on partner visas and child visas. We could put parent visas to one side because there's a set of policy questions there. There's two factors which broadly have been, to be fair to the department, outside your control. One is the level of staff and resourcing that you're allocated by the government of the day, and the other is the decisions in the family migration program, the number of visas, the planning level as it's called, and we can get into that. So I just want to put those there, that yes, I've been a critic of the former government around the cut of about 1,000 FTE over their term of government from visa processing, and have advocated around the composition of the program. They're not issues which really can be usefully dealt with through here because they're kind of almost givens when the Audit Office does its work or you turn up to work. How much resources, the level of resourcing you have or the number of visas you're asked to grant are your decisions of government. I want to get one thing on the record then though, and thank you for the opening statement. That's an incredibly welcome update to see that level of progress in clearing out the backlog which has been there. But just in terms of FTE, and you might want to take it on notice, but if you could just outline for us, the report had some details. What the average staffing level, I quote, for the migration program decreased from 2015-16 to 2021. In 21-22 there were 1,959 staff allocated to support temporary migration visa processing functions, with 1,140 staff in Australia and 819 offshore. My understanding is that's increased in the order now of about 600 staff totally, but perhaps if you could just update us on that and take on notice the specific detail, that would be very helpful.
That's correct. We have seen a significant increase in the number of staff working on visa processing. In respect to the family program, I might ask my colleagues to update on the details. I can speak more broadly about all of the programs.
Mm-hmm. And just very briefly, it's not the main focus, we just need to get it on the record.
Sure. In terms of the additional resourcing that Mr Willard has referenced with regards to the family migration program, which is the family visa branch, which is a fairly broad range of programs in that particular branch. There's approximately 130 additional staff that have been attributed to that effort, and I put a slight caveat on that because at times, we need to help surge and work in other programs at certain times. But, just as a general guide, that's the approximate.
That's quid pro quo. You move resources, that's normal.
Yes, can I?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Can I just add, Chair, just on the particular age caseload as it goes to the previously impacted ministerial direction 80 caseload, that dedicated team based out of Melbourne has seen quite a significant uptick in resources as well, from around about 30 to currently 47, and that's been a big driver behind that productivity.
Well, you've reduced the pre-2016 lot by 89%. I'd also just declare, and I'll get into some of the issues, but my electorate has more people born in Afghanistan than any in the parliament, and this is human misery in my foyer pretty much every day for the last 5 years. People crying, wailing, having sit-ins because they're separated from their kids or have never met their children. So, look, and maybe it's a question to the Audit Office to start with. One of the things that really struck me reading this report when it was tabled and then rereading it over the last few days is its clinical nature. There's nothing in it that reflects what I see as the humanity of the human impacts of delays in partner and child visa processing. It goes to both the department, because the department's been called out, I guess, for not consulting with family members and not properly advising governments every year in the annual program, not reflecting the voices, or haven't detected any policy advice that says to government, well, if you don't increase the planning level, here are the consequences. But similarly, the Audit Office has not reflected things like the human impact of family separation when it takes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to process a visa, and you've never either met your own children or missed them growing up. The human impact of the number of people that I've had to speak to over the years, and not from Afghanistan, from other countries. You know, if you fall in love with a white person from America or Germany, you'll get a visa within 5, 6 months usually. If you happen to fall in love with someone from Africa, it can take 3, 4, 5 years if you're stuck in the Nairobi black hole. We'll get to the stats. The number of people who've lost their chance in life to ever have a child because they're too old for IVF, nothing like that comes through. The social issues caused for Australia when we're now bringing thousands of people, largely from Quetta in Pakistan but other places, who've been living in shanty towns, refugee camps and not going to school. We're dumping them in my community and other suburbs around the country on partner visas without the humanitarian settlement support. They've grown up effectively as refugees. For all intents and purposes, they're a refugee. We're now just bringing them in on partner visas. They're teenage boys who've never lived with their father. There's no reflection of the social reality of these delays and policy settings. There's nothing reflected about the sheer waste for the department or the costs for applicants of having to do your medical tests 2, 3, 4, 5 times in some cases, sometimes travelling at great expense, risking your life literally in the back of a van because you've paid someone to get you from one town in Pakistan to another for the 5th time to do your medicals because the department just drops it into a black hole. I think I've made the point, but I'd put to you, why has the department never seemed to write this stuff down, turn its mind to it, or advise the government of the day of the human cost?
I might respond first, and I'm not sure if you're addressing the ANAO or the department.
Because this is what we deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd make the point in response to the audit findings. There has been a significant increase in the terms of consultation we do in respect of the program and also outreach to affected communities. And that information is fed back into the wider process by which government determines what the migration program composition may be each year. We have made significant progress in terms of outreach, particularly with the caseload I mentioned before, which is the one that was, because of a ministerial direction, was one we were not able to process as a priority. We have conducted a number of exercises of outreach specifically with that caseload through a number of the migration agents who represent large parts of the caseload, also through the parliamentary liaison network in order to provide more advice to applicants and interested parties about how the process works, but also to be in a better position to be able to feed back the concerns. That's not to say it's available to government to immediately act to provide a number of places in the program to be able to us to process the entire caseload, but we have seen significant progress in terms of on hands, as I touched on.
Yeah, we'll get to what I'd call the illegal caps later. I'm not having a go at you personally as officers, but I feel like deja vu where a few years ago we had the same discussion with the department on the citizenship delays that have a whole range of quasi-similar impacts. Perhaps not egregious, as missing your kids growing up, but pretty profound impacts. And I invited the department then to leave Canberra and come and meet some of these people. It is just genuinely astounding to me, given the tens of thousands of letters you get from members of parliament, the trauma you get on your call centre every day, that none of this seems to matter in the Canberra world. We just do numbers and stats, like these are real people.
I'd suggest our officers are very conscious that they're real people, Mr Hill, and particularly in the family program. Our officers look into the details of their stories, and that's a very challenging thing to do. We are constrained, of course, by having to act in accordance with migration law, but also within whatever.
Well, that's in terms of the processing. I'm trying to sort of stick on the policy advice.
Yeah.
Every year you provide advice to government on the composition of the migration program. Mm-hmm. Governments for some time have played a silly fake game of running a headline number, and we have a fake cut to migration, and then we just let temporary visas blow out, which is a different problem. But in advising government on what the headline number should be, which becomes the media fetish and the media focus, there's great lengths that are gone to talk to business and to talk to chambers of commerce and to talk to captains of industry and to talk to state and territory governments. I used to run that program, probably recall many years ago in Skilled and Business in Victoria. Like we talk and we talk and we plan and we input and we talk to the economy, but there's nothing that was fed in about actual Australians and the people they love.
Yeah, I would.
But that has to be considered a failure in the policy advising process, doesn't it?
I'd point out we have introduced processes.
We fixed up the failure of 10 years.
Since that time, and we do have a community organisation roundtable which involves a wide range of representatives of communities in Australia, and that's an input into the process. It is an input among a whole range of other inputs that government, of course, has to balance up.
Yeah. And I suppose to the Audit Office, it's a question I'm curious about. How in this kind of report can you, should you, do you, why didn't you, why don't you, maybe there's good answers, reflect the human experience of citizens? Because if I think about two parallels, where on many other audits you see an evidence gap or you think the department hasn't done something, on grants sometimes you go back and you calculate what the answer would have been, like you do the work and present it. You have on other occasions used surveys to supplement and bring other voices in. I read this report and none of my daily experience I see or read in here, except for the numbers, and we'll get to them.
You described it earlier as clinical, and we pride ourselves on being clinical. And one of the things that we try to do in our report is be as flat as possible. And where we do use case studies or examples, we try to use them in the context of giving a case study this is the norm, not this is an outlier or something like that. And it usually goes directly to an example of a failure with respect to the implementation of the policy that we're trying to address. And in this particular case, the policy framework doesn't go to the things that you're talking about. It's not part of the decision-making process. You talked about it before in terms of this type of information not being put to the policy advice, to government. We described that as they consulted with industry but not with the community, because that was the activity of the public service. To go to what might the community have said risks us getting into an advocacy point of view, which could, in my view, affect the reputation of the organisation of having a policy view in that type of space. And we try very hard to be very flat in what we do, because that because we can try and maintain credibility in our work as not having a particular position. Sometimes we do. In the last hearing, you read out what the OECD had said about what the impact of the black economy is, and we do that when there's something on the record from a source in a similar area that talks about those things, which doesn't look like an advocacy point of view, but a sort of factual relevance point of view. I didn't exclude anything like that from this report. It wasn't evidence that we identified in the report that went to the effective implementation of the policy framework, which is what we're trying to do. So they're the reasons we don't go to that type of case study or example.
I take your point about case studies and the need to be very careful not to engage in advocacy or emotional manipulation or hyperbole. That's our job. Self-deprecating for you, the Chair, Deputy Chair. I suppose I'd just ask the question, though, what about the use of surveys or more structured analytical techniques to inform the work?
We do surveys on occasions, but The questions we would have asked in this context would have went to not to the impact of the decisions, but to the consistency with the policy framework.
Yeah.
And I don't think we would have asked, even if we did a survey, we wouldn't have asked the type of questions that you're talking about, because they don't. The impact of the government's decision of delays in visas isn't part of the decision-making process, which goes to the point you made about policy advice.
Well, here I am to help fill the gap. Okay, we all have our roles. The other couple of things, I think, if I recall the report correctly, that were not reflected in the advice to government aren't just the human experience, but waiting times, impacts on likely waiting times, given this is a stock and flow thing. How many applications do we get in a year? How many are we going to process? Gives you a sense of how many you're not going to process and how the average wait times go out. Why did the department not, year after year, advise government on the consequences of its decisions to not increase or to cut the number of places? And I suppose that goes to both child, partner, but also parent visas. I think I've said before that I think the age parent visa is a scam.
I'd make the point that, again, there's been, since the audit, there's certainly been progress in that respect in terms of our capacity to forecast and look at implications of different program sizes on caseloads. Obviously, we're forecasting application rates, which is not a precise science, but that is something that we do look at. In previous years, I think the impacts in terms of the whole migration program are certainly considered. I'd suggest probably the fiscal impacts are the strongest consideration. And so the judgments that governments have to make go to fiscal impact of the program as a whole, as well as broader implications for Australia around the balance between skilled and family migration, those sort of elements.
Well, they do, but in most other policy domains, governments also get advice about, well, you know, what's the impact on waiting times? I mean, in DHS land, you've been a minister in DHS land, if you're thinking about, well, how much money do I need to get from ERC, one of the first things you say is, well, how long are citizens going to have to wait? This is not a radical concept. It's just, I've said my bit about the humanity, but it still seems utterly peculiar that given this is fundamentally a stock and flow issue, like Services Australia Centrelink, why the department responsible wouldn't be just routinely advising government on waiting times.
We're certainly doing that certainly since the audit and before. There's regular information updated about waiting times. There's a very close focus on what sort of outputs we're achieving. Government's made a significant investment, as you pointed out, in providing us with 500 additional staff, and we are accounting for that. We report weekly to our ministers on progress across all of our caseloads.
Well, I'll pay you a compliment and say it's really delightful to see you sitting here as the Acting Deputy Secretary, because you actually understand the migration system. I've seen that for many years, unlike the culture under the previous secretary, where we seem to often appoint people to be Deputy Secretaries who didn't have a clue about migrational visas, which became evident from trying to talk to them about it. So I have great confidence that, you know, people who've actually come up through the stovepipe and run policy programs may have some better ability to reflect this stuff back to government in the future. So the application fee got indexed again. It's about $9,000 a year for a partner visa. Is that about right?
Just below 8,850.
Right. So how does that compare to other countries in the world? Can you point me to a country that has a more expensive partner visa?
I think we're at the top end. I don't know if Mr Noble can add anything about other countries that might be more expensive than that.
Yes, we do routinely, of course, have a look at that comparative figure with other countries, and I can confirm that we do have it at the high end.
So we've won the gold medal.
Charge.
Right.
From countries we look at,
You'd be pretty sure that
lots of systems out there, but we typically look at the major migration receiving countries as by way of comparison.
So what's the average cost of processing a partner visa?
We can provide some information about the budget allocated to the branch that handles the processing. We don't have that particular figure available
So
here.
my recollection is the Department of Finance, under regulatory impact statements and the costs and charging rules, and this is a user fee and charge, isn't it? It's not a tax?
This is tax.
It's a tax, is it?
Yeah.
So
These are application charges that are tax.
So they're a tax. So you don't actually have to do the regulatory impact statement, you just charge what you want.
There are, I think actually in the migration legislation, there are some constraints on what you can charge.
Right.
I think there's regulations that go to that.
So the department's not able to tell the committee how much on average, and I get there's a whole range of costs, but how much on average it costs to process a partner visa?
We could take it on notice and give you a figure.
Okay, that would be good. Can we go to waiting times? One of the things which has always frustrated me trying to read the crystal ball of your website, at least before December 2023, was that all anyone could figure out was the so-called average processing time. At some point, the previous government decided to get rid of KPIs and transparent measures and move to these mysterious average processing times. But the really weird bit is that they exclude, they're only average processing times of the cases you choose to process. They're not average processing times of the thousands or tens of thousands of cases at a given point in time that you're not processing. Is that a reasonable takeout?
Yeah, the processing times are calculated based on the date of finalisation, so it's a date of application to date of finalisation.
So in terms of giving many applicants a sense of when they might have some hope and can plan their lives, ever meet their children, hang out with their wife, start a family, they're just garbage.
We have changed our approach with partners in particular, and one of the challenges with partners is because we had this chunk of caseload that we were not able, through a ministerial direction, to move. We have a caseload which, if you like, is what I characterise as a healthy caseload would have a if you like, a sloping graph from shorter application periods to longer. So you'd have more applications recently lodged, less applications lodged a long time ago.
Yeah.
That would be a healthy
That would be a pipeline moving through.
The picture that we have, and this is a consequence of having a ministerial direction which meant we could not process certain elements of the caseload, the picture that we have is more of a U shape at the moment. And it has been improving. I cited some of the numbers where we've been improving that figure. In consequence of that, one of the challenges with partner is that because we calculate processing times based on finalisations, when you have a caseload that has a lot of old cases, processing times can appear to blow out even though you're finalising a lot of the old cases. So we have introduced...
No, believe me, I get that, because I saw the horror of October, November, December. Once you started moving the cases out of the bottom drawer, all of a sudden the average processing times shot up to 3 or 4, 5 years, and everyone got angry.
So we've now updated our information to be clear that we're talking about a cohort that is not affected by MD80. As I said, the cohort that were affected by the ministerial direction have all been contacted. And so that's an effort to more adequately reflect what people applying now can expect in terms of processing.
Okay, so the MD80 are the major distortion, but they're not the only cases that we've found that don't progress. So, I mean, I think even putting aside MD80, which is the biggest impact but not the only one, it still remains the case that the current approach to publishing processing times just ignores cases which the department decides not to process or chooses not to process or can't process for whatever reason or forgets.
The current approach, yes, it only reflects finalisations. Right. It doesn't reflect on-hand cases.
So has any consideration been given to a more honest and transparent approach? I mean, paragraph 3.28 in the report says, I'll quote, "The United Kingdom Visas and Immigration Service introduced service standards in 2014 for the expected time to complete different application types to improve its focus on service outcomes. The service provides information on its website about performance against standards for particular visa categories. Clients are advised if their application will not be finalised within the standard." Have you thought about this since you made the change?
We have given consideration to how we can address that issue. One of the underlying points, though, is we have contacted the cohort who are in that older caseload group individually, so they understand their circumstances. What we now have is, if you like, a more normal situation with the way we publish our processing times, which gives a better indication to people applying what they might be able to expect.
Right.
But I should add, we are always considering what we can do in terms of more transparency that helps with understanding the process. The reasons for that are, one, it's good to be more transparent, but the other element is it helps our officers with handling the caseload because there are less inquiries and less issues emerging, the more information we can provide.
Yeah, but the more we can cut down the utterly infuriating and wasteful loop of distressed people calling up and emailing and having to respond, like the hamster wheel, and actually focus on cases, the better.
Yeah.
But giving people information that they can manage their lives with helps do that.
If I can just add to that as well, Chair, there is a relatively new tool on the website which potential clients who are looking to lodge an application can put in a date and the visa that they're applying for to give them an indication of the timeframes by which that visa would be processed, just to provide a little bit more guardrails around the decision to make that application.
Yeah, okay. Well, that should stop people falling for the aged parent scam where they apply for a visa and then realise later it's going to be 30 years and their parent will be dead, ask for a refund and don't get one.
We have a separate dedicated area on the website with regards to the parent question that you raised to make it clearer.
I think we've described it as a scam
timeframes
before.
We do have we do our best to be clear. We have it on the website. This is what we expect the processing times to be for aged parent, for both the contributory one and the other one. I think it's 12 years and 29 years is what we have on our website.
Yeah, okay. So can I just loop back to the human impact and a policy thing that falls out of the waiting time issue? One of the things I see, and I'm just curious what analysis you've done and whether that's seen in the audit and whether you've advised government, previous government or subsequently, the now Leader of the Opposition, when he was Minister, changed the dependent rule on the partner visas, as I recall, so that once your child turns 23, they can't come as a dependent. Now, there has to be a general rule. It's higher than some countries, lower than others. That's the rule. A consequence, though, which has been known for years and years of this, is in relation to people from certain countries, Afghanistan, the Middle East, Africa being the general ones, like where you've got a really awful processing time. And I think the rule applied from lodged after late 2016, was it? 2016, 2017?
I can't recall the specifics.
You can take it on
when
notice,
it came
specifics, but sometime around then. That if you've got a child who's 18 or 19 when they apply and they're a dependent, and the department takes 6 years to process your case, there is literally no way for that child to come unless they meet a skilled visa. The number of fathers that I've had to explain to, it happens every week, I'm sorry, you have to leave your daughter with the Taliban, is incomprehensible. I can't go to a festival in my electorate without being chased by crying fathers who've abandoned their daughter. Has the department ever given any policy advice to at least reflect back to the former Leader of the Opposition or to any subsequent minister how abhorrent that is and the practical impact since Kabul fell?
We are going to contents of policy advice provided. I can say the department has been working with government on a solution for that particular issue, and we are handling the caseload in a way that will let us manage a solution should one be available to us. Ultimately, we're making decisions in line with what the regulations require.
I understand, which is why I'm not criticising you for not making the decision, because you can't, but it's October 21, Kabul fell. This problem started emerging maybe 3 or 5 months after when you started drip-feeding some of those old applications. It accelerated under the new government when we put in more staff in, and I've been writing for 12 months about it. My understanding, I'll be careful not to betray private conversations, is that there's been a lot of interest in changing this rule, but 12 months, no decent advice from the department.
So I can say we're certainly engaging with government on the issue. The other element in respect of this is we do priority process cases that are heading towards that deadline.
I understand that. The problem is in the human, and it's thousands of cases, or hundreds at least in that category, probably thousands. The human impact is people come in and say, so I have to choose between bringing my other 2 children and wife who's hiding in Pakistan or Iran or somewhere and leaving one behind, or somehow waiting for the next few months because maybe a rule will change. That's the dilemma people are currently stuck in.
We understand, and we're very cognizant of the the human impacts of the decisions we have to make. We do have to make the decisions in line with the regulations we have to
Certainly
work with.
criticising the previous government, partly criticising our government because it's 18 months and we still haven't fixed it.
If I could just
The Department won't serve up paperwork.
If I could just add, Chair, a couple of comments there, just to maybe provide some assurances with regards to how that's operationalised by the team that manages this caseload.
Yeah,
they are really very attuned to the issue, very sensitised to this issue, and also are very cognisant of those very difficult circumstances. Mr. Noble might have more details, but essentially that team has a very robust system in place to try to really identify and finalise an application before that situation eventuates.
I appreciate that they're difficult cases for your staff to deal with.
In early days.
When you've got a DNA test.
Certainly there was a few cases that were already in that cohort. There was a much reduced number in those circumstances now. So it's a very conscious, active conversation that happens on a very regular basis with the team.
Thanks, Jody. Chair, if you don't mind me just adding, I just confirm that when Ministerial Direction 80 was revoked in February 2023 and replaced with Ministerial Direction 102, which allows for a compelling and compassionate circumstance to bring a case forward in priority. There is a policy instruction that sits alongside that, that all our visa processing officers absolutely work to, and it calls out as a compelling circumstance the ageing out of dependents. So it's a strong direction here. And if you don't mind, I'll just also add on a similar matter, we're very alive and alert to the concern around health expiry. People certainly in country in Afghanistan who have made that journey, and if that health validity, of course, usually a 12-month period, we're very alive to that expiry. We don't obviously advocate for that dangerous journey sometimes for that criteria to be met, but when it has been met, that is something we look to prioritise as well, noting other criteria would need to be met.
Thank you. So what's the trend in partner visa applications? Have we seen consistent growth in the rate of applications?
Certainly we saw a reduction below historical trends during COVID, as you'd expect, and we've seen a gradual return to pre-COVID trends. One of the team will have the numbers, but it's growing, but not growing to a massive extent.
I can provide, Chair, as at the 26th of January, so our first stage partner visa lodgements have increased this program year by 28%. Compared with the year-to-date period for 22-23.
Okay, so we had the COVID bump, and my reading of the website says 16% growth, back to sort of a normal level post-COVID. But even during COVID, it was still 44,000 a year. People were still getting married, and there are still Australians overseas and all that kind of stuff. But it's sort of back jump, and it's 28% already above what it was previous year. So it's reasonable to say we've seen growth in the rate of applications. So why are additional people applying from in Australia as opposed to offshore?
We're talking about relationships that form and people making the basis of applications on those relationships. The team might want to expand. Some of my comments might be a bit speculative. There's been a big reduction in international travel for a period of time. And I'd expect it will take a little bit of time before that travel starts occurring again, people start meeting each other, relationships form and result in partner visa applications. Just let the team add anything in respect of that.
No, nothing to add.
We'll take it on notice because you might want to check with the team.
Perhaps also might be, absolutely, but perhaps also the grant of the visa can happen in Australia. There was a period of time when partner visas were granted offshore.
So that was a rule change I remember I campaigned for on television for months, where previously, I don't know why it took so long to change, but anyway, it mustn't have been very effective. Previously, if you applied offshore, you had to be offshore when the visa was granted, which during COVID was bizarre. We've proved that they were tying up dozens, hundreds of quarantine places for people flying from Melbourne to Auckland to have their visa granted and coming back 2 days later. But it took about a year before that was changed after I first raised it. But so was that a temporary change or is it a permanent change? Because it was originally a temporary change in the regulation. Have you extended it?
That's correct. It was what we broadly called a COVID concession at the time, but that now is a standard feature.
Oh, good. 3 cheers. So when the demand for partner visa increases, stock and flow with higher lodgements, as we're seeing, population grows, people travelling, whatever reason, how does the migration program respond? Do we grant more visas? Do we have longer waiting times? Do we refuse more?
What we're seeing in terms of lodgement, if you like, demand, is a factor that goes into consideration in the context of the migration submission. As I said, though, there's a whole range of factors there that have to be considered.
Well, I'm just going back to first principles. The legislation and the department says with a straight face on its website that this is a demand-driven program with the highest fee we've been able to ascertain anywhere in the world. So when more people fall in love with and get married, do we grant more visas or do we see longer waiting times?
Well, it will depend on what the program settings are in the migration program from year to year in terms of places available in the program.
Right.
The department then allocates resources according to the planning level of government settings.
Okay, so effectively the answer is you live within whatever the planning level you're given is. Okay. So let's then... So is it reasonable to say, I mean, I've got a couple of paragraphs in the report that touch on this, but is it reasonable for the Deputy Chair and I to conclude that where there's a raise in the planning levels, we process more visas and waiting times would reduce, all things being equal, depending on the flow, the stock coming in, and where there's a cut to the planning levels, waiting times would increase?
As a basic proposition, yes.
Okay. So I'm just looking at para 2.21 and 2.22. Okay, that was policy advice to government, so that's a separate issue that was not fully reflected in the advice to government, was the impact on waiting times and so on. Okay, so I suppose the thing that I'm getting to, and you know exactly where I'm going, is the Migration Act says that government, the department, has no power to impose a cap on the number of partner visas or child visas to be granted every year. And if I recall correctly, under the Hawke government tried to change that and give the minister a power to cap those visas. The Senate rejected it. I recall that the Howard government tried to change the Act and in effect give the minister the power to cap those visa classes, and the Senate rejected it. So it's pretty clear, we've gone over this in previous things years ago, it's pretty clear that the department and the minister have no power to cap the number of visas to be granted every year, and yet the audit report, common experience over many years and the evidence we've just discussed is the department grants, in effect, caps the number of visas every year.
Well, it's not a cap. You're correct. The Migration Act doesn't allow for the application of a cap to the partner and child visas. Caps apply in other caseloads like parent. What does happen, though, is government sets a planning level in respect of a program and the department allocates resources accordingly.
So what does demand-driven mean if not a marketing slogan?
Demand-driven is simply that there's no inhibitor on applications being lodged.
Right.
The number of applications is driven by the demand for individuals who are minded to make an application.
Okay. The former Deputy Secretary of some years ago, Abel Rizvi, I think, has talked publicly about how when he was there was clear legal advice that the department had no legal basis to do what it had done for years of effectively cap the number of visas. And we started prosecuting this publicly for a couple of years, and then magically you invented the language of demand-driven, which doesn't seem to relate to granting visas. It relates, you've said now, to anyone can keep applying for visas and fill the pipeline. But if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Like the planning level is a cap in practical terms.
In terms of the Migration Act, it's not a cap program. There's no cap applied to the program.
Right. Well, I'd continue to characterise it as an illegal cap, but there you go. The other thing that makes me just shake my head that this is not according to the resources that government gave you, your phrase earlier, is this hilarious spike which happens around June and July. Now, if you were actually limited by resources, some years you'd be a bit over, some years you'd be a bit under. And yet the audit report shows, and I think previous FOI documents showed actual instructions from Canberra to posts around the world in June to stop granting partner visas because we'd reached the cap. And then magically in the first week of July we press the button and all the partner visas spit out. Like, that's a cap. How can you actually credibly say that's not a cap and that you're not managing according to the planning level, you're not managing to resources because you could have pressed the button in June?
We're working towards the planning level that government has set for us, and people are diverted to other activities or diverted back into the family program in line with that planning level. What you will see is typically, I have to say, in the last year or so, this hasn't happened. We've been in a much better position around the program. Typically, though, there'll be a whole range of requests go out for information with a view to decision-ready applications coming back in time to finalise them in June. Many of those don't come back in time to do that, in which case you'll see a whole range finalised in July.
Sure, that's one scenario, but I mean, there was clear FOI evidence of instructions being given from Canberra to Post to stop processing because we reached the planning level, the cap, whatever you want to call it. That's not a limitation on resources. That's not stuff coming backwards and forwards. That's a conscious decision to say to people, no, we're not demand-driven, no, we're not complying with the legislation, we're just living by this planning level which has nothing to do with resources. It's about delivering the program down to the last zero.
Which hasn't been achieved every year, but it's
pretty much every year.
Yeah, there's been
you reallocated 10,000 from during COVID to skilled, but
and a few years previous it was well below the planning level. But the intent is to deploy resources to meet the planning level that's set by government.
Can you point us just in the audit report, just so we're all clear? There was a chart that I've somehow lost which shows the June, July.
3.4.
57. Yeah. It can go down. It's going to go up. Okay. And I mean, it goes to recommendations that we could make. The impact, what I think any punter, citizen, applicant would understand as demand-driven. If I think about demand-driven in human services, in the NDIA, it means if you need it, you get it, and we move it through as quickly as possible. There's not a resource limitation, there's not a cap. The NDIS is a demand-driven program. Unemployment benefits, the age pension are demand-driven. If you meet the criteria, you get the thing.
Well, actually, that's not quite correct, because with Medicare, PBS, for example, while they're demand-driven, the government can still control the levers, so supply and eligibility.
Oh, sure.
So even though they're demand, they are still controllable within allocated budget, so it's not still... And well, the NDIA doesn't have those controls, which is one of the reasons it's
indeed
in trouble.
I think the way people understand, as opposed to, say, aged care, home care packages, where there's a clear rationed number that you can hand out each year.
I mean, in Migration Act speak, there's no cap in relation to the partner visa cohort.
In real world speak, there is.
The presence of on-hand applications, many of the on-hand applications, of course, don't yet meet the criteria or haven't been considered to meet the criteria or have outstanding requirements. Yeah. So it's not applications.
So I can't ask you for opinions on policy. I'm going to ask you to point to perhaps the evidence. What I'm curious about, I suppose, is, and something that we can think about, is whether we could recommend that the partner and child visas simply be unbundled from the headline number, which governments do, because the policy rationale, but maybe you could point me towards other policy rationales, not give an opinion, appear to be somewhat different, like the economy's needs, pressure on housing, those kind of things. Partners and children come and live with their spouse. Like, some of those rationales don't apply.
Without, obviously, open to the committee to make whatever recommendations they wish. I make the point that over many decades in managing migration, governments have always had to balance these questions, and it's a difficult balancing act, and that'd be a matter to consider in terms of implications. Some of the considerations that are public that I could point to go to things like Treasury's published analysis on the fiscal impact of newly arrived migrants, which is a document they have available, which gives a sense of what the fiscal impacts of the different cohorts of migrants are, which of course, for as long as I've been doing this, is always, regardless of the stripe of governments, always been a key consideration. So there's a lot to balance in considering that.
Yeah, I mean,
obviously
that's
open to the committee to...
That's the reason why parent visa demand can never really be met, because of the fiscal considerations.
I mean, it's very clear from the Treasury analysis that parents are fiscally have a big negative impact.
Yeah, even the contributory stuff.
And I hasten to add, I'm not suggesting there are other positive impacts. I'm just referring to that fiscal lens.
Okay. Is there anything the Audit Office wanted to add at this point on those issues?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So, just if we could go back to the sort of average waiting time by post. I might invite the Audit Office just to sort of point towards or summarise some of the evidence or findings for us. The Department states that it runs a global allocation model, which in theory should mean that there's broad consistency across the world. Doesn't mean every application is going to be processed, and my understanding would be that, of course, some countries are going to be easier if you've got English language documents, if you've got a Five Eyes kind of relationship, so your security checks are more automated and things just happen more quickly. Like, I get that there's going to be difference. But even allowing for those differences, is the intent of the global allocation model that caseloads are managed, workloads are managed between offices, and that the waiting times by region should not be wildly divergent?
I'll let the team go into detail. The focus we have, though, is on processing times overall for the caseload. I'll let the team talk about how the global allocation model works and how we shift resources and caseloads around. Jodie.
Chair, the global allocation model has been a really successful mechanism for us to start to shift work where people are. So noting that we process our partner visas, for example, onshore and offshore, of course, offshore posts in various locations. We do get situations where we can't always move particular caseloads for whatever reason, resourcing issues, recruitment problems, challenges, crises, etc. So a few years ago, which just really kicked in around COVID, we supported a centralised model by which we looked at the global partner caseload and looked at mechanisms to put work where we had the decision makers to support a decision. So that lifted out, big lumps of work that may have sitted at one post that had little or, diminished opportunity to really progress those cases. So it's lifting that out and starting to load share the work is the sort of the general concept of that model, which is still in place today. It's fair to say, that really, the rubber started to really hit the road on that through COVID, and that has matured over time. I think there's still things that we're working through on that, but it's been a successful way for us to shift work out of locations where applications can get stuck. We have the systems, or better allocation systems now, to be able to do that, and redeploy caseloads into other areas, onshore and offshore, or in between posts.
Can the Audit Office just comment on what you observed?
So we did provided some information on the breakdown of average processing times by different regions, and then broke down one of the specific regions because offshore officers can distribute applications between their regions. So from that, we started with the proposition that therefore there should be generally consistent processing times within that region, and table 3.8 on page 72 of the report sets out the average processing times within one particular region, and you can see the differences.
So we'll go to the specifics in a minute, but so does the global, just to be clear, you've got a set of regions and then within a given region you've got a set of officers. Yep, that's right. Okay. So is the global processing time meant to try and provide some equity or balance in workloads, outcomes and so on between regions or just within regions?
Between, we process caseloads globally. So, and this really came to the fore in COVID, where we'd have whole posts shut down and we weren't able to handle caseload. So you could have a caseload from a different region processed within another region, or indeed in Australia. I think we could come to the specifics. The point, I guess, that we're getting to, and we're happy to look at this. I'm looking at the team to make sure I'm not giving them an impossible task, but I think you'd need to look at both processing office and citizenship to get a sense of it, rather than just focusing on processing office, because there'll be decisions at different times. There might be a surge in applications in a post. We're not in a position to provide more people for that post, so another post would take some of those applications. So to get a picture, I think you need a slightly more nuanced view. Noting our processes developed a lot, particularly during COVID, but since then as well.
So, yes.
Because I think that goes towards some of what we said in the report, that there is a lot of data available within Home Affairs. We felt it could be better used to identify how greater efficiency.
So there's a lot of data. We have a goal, but you didn't see evidence that it was being properly applied, consistent with the intent.
To identify where efficiencies could be gained in processing.
Yeah, or just where you've got a surge, you've got to move some cases. So, I mean, if I look at the table 3.7, over those 4 years, and yes, there's COVID, but that was everywhere, the only region where the average processing time went down materially, well, it went down at all, is the Americas. You could get a visa on average in about a year. Again, this table, as I understand the footnotes, is it still only relates to the cases you process. So MD80 and all the sort of bottom drawer stuff's not mucking up these statistics. Yeah, these are broadly apples and apples.
Processing times are always finalised cases.
Yep. So if you fall in love with someone from the Americas, you're on average we're getting a visa in a year. Bit over a year, 4 years at the start, bit at, about a year at the end. But if you fall in love with someone from Europe or Sub-Saharan Africa, and we'll get to the breakdown of that, the average processing time was shooting up towards 2 years. The Middle East was just an abomination, almost doubled over that period. The Pacific, similarly. The others moved up. They're not great. But the community experiences this from reading letters, talking to people. Like there's Facebook communities, there's social media communities, there's partner visa support groups that try and support each other through this black hole as they experience it of separation from their loved ones. They live their lives on WhatsApp 3 times a day. That's what daily life is like for years on end. But the community experiences this as blatant discrimination. And it's compounded, tell me if this is wrong, but if you fall in love with someone from, Europe or the Americas or, actually a lot of southeast bits of Southeast Asia, certainly North Asia, you can actually just get a visitor visa and come here and wait and be together. So it's pain, but you can wait. If you fall in love with someone from these countries, the department will never give you a visitor visa, almost exclusively. If you're from Somalia or Nigeria or most of these countries,
for a wedding,
you're actually separated. So it's a compounded discrimination.
Yeah. I think, just on your point, I think if you look at the broad in terms of visitor visa approval rates, in the broad that comment would be supported, but I just suggest it's not never. Every consideration is an individual consideration, looking at, weighing up all the factors.
I spent 3 years trying to get a visitor visa for a lawyer with huge assets from Syria. Every possible proof. There was nothing more you could have proved that she would go home. She'd travelled to the UK, she'd travelled everywhere, but no. Too old to have kids.
Those considerations in terms of visitor visas are separate considerations. They're made on an individual basis. I think
as a general comment.
The broadest, as a general comment though, there would be higher approval rates from countries that generally represent less risk in terms of
I understand the
not complying with the visitor visa.
Yeah.
In respect to the partner stuff, I guess that there's a couple of comments. We do process in line with ministerial directions and then broadly in order of lodgement. That doesn't mean, though, that a case that is progressing, if you like, smoothly because it's complete when the application is lodged, because all of the verifications have been done, won't progress more quickly than a case that was lodged at the same time, which may have a whole range of factors that we need to resolve in it. That there is a reflection of the fact that it is, some caseloads are more difficult.
You also have high rates of fraud in some parts of the world.
High rates of that's an element. Yep. It's also evidencing relationships, all sorts of issues. Identity can be an issue. All those sort of issues go into this factor, into these what you see in these timeframes. There's no discrimination in the program on the basis of ethnicity or race or nationality, but there are criteria that are applied to everyone in the program in the same way.
Yeah, I understand that I'm not going to see a document where the department or the government of the day says what I want you to do is actively discriminate against Muslims and black people or people from these countries. But the human experience is that is exactly what happens. And these stats, because of the visitor visa problem, actually obscure if we were to try and measure human reality of time I am separated from the person I love, these stats significantly understate or distort that problem. They don't reflect the reality of that experience. Well, and I'm not suggesting they were trying to, but I'm just making the point.
I'm keen to put more information to public record just to demonstrate the issue. So if it's helpful, I can take on notice some updating of these tables. Obviously, this was a document produced in the context of the audit. We've made significant progress since then. I think, though, you will still see that processing times are different for different locations, and it goes to those factors that I was talking about around the complexity of application, the issues we have to deal with.
Yeah.
To take your example, if there's an application from America and there's an application from Africa that are both presented in a way that are able to be finalised, I'd expect they're both finalised at the same time. If that's a assurance I could make.
Yeah, okay. Well, it would be interesting to see the data. I fully expect and would, have said so publicly to defend the former government and been consistent, I think, that you'll continue to see the disparities for those reasons you identified. But I still can't understand why the massive divergence where, some regions flatline and go the other way and some just spike. It can't be global processing being allocated.
The other context here, well, this is part of what global processing is trying to smooth out, but the other context here is the underlying volumes of applications, which also is a story.
Yeah, but isn't that the point of the global processing thing? If you get a higher volume, take away the Taliban problem, because that's a spike. Yeah. If you get a higher volume, you should be able to just move them around.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing. Some of the data here is early days or pre-global processing model.
Yeah, okay.
But I will undertake to provide as much more information we can on that issue. As I said, I also expect you'll still see a differentiation when you look at it this way.
Which regions do you get the highest rates of fraud? I mean, previous inquiries, the Senate inquiry on dowry abuse and, community information, a lot of work on this, suggests that South Asia, to be country agnostic, and certain parts of Africa are probably the regions where you get dowry, the marriage market, basically selling Australian citizenship through a fake marriage and dowry. But where do you get the highest rates of fraud?
if we can state a broad regions, I think that might
let's
be the
stay
way
country
to
agnostic.
Respond. South Asia is certainly an issue. We see issues in the Middle East. We see issues in Africa, but I'll let Matthew or Jody add.
Yes, I can confirm that that is where we see the main elements of fraud come through. Obviously, our visa processing officers have a range of tools at their disposal to look at the authenticity of documents, the integrity of what's being provided, etc. And just sort of making a comment as well around the global caseload allocation. That goes to, I think, your question, Chair, around fraud, integrity, risk, etc. In October 2023, out of an ANAO recommendation, we've also now got a global risk tiering system in place. So there's no distinction there between onshore and offshore. So that's another opportunity for us to have a look at making sure if we do move work around, we're very alive to those integrity concerns, and our visa decision makers in areas around the globe are supported with a universal view of risk.
Yeah, no, that's fair, and you've got language and that risk-based knowledge, fair enough. Auditor-General?
I wasn't quite certain whether the information that you requested went to the categorisation of the timeliness of visa issues by risk category, by region, which we didn't pick up in the report because I'm not certain the data was that available at the time. But if that data's available, that might give you comfort if you could do that by area, that people with the same categorisation.
But if it has any correlation with the significant spikes, you'd expect to see year by year a significant spike in the risk threshold. My anecdotal gut feeling is South Asia's been sitting at the top for years.
Could we? I think that's a suggestion that's probably worth looking at. Again, I think it's in our interest to put as much information out about this issue. We might. I'm just not sure off the top of the head if we'd be able to do it in terms of the broad risk categorisation that applies, and then the regional impact. I'm not sure, but we can take it on notice.
Yeah, like I'm being very critical in the rearview mirror, and I'm making the point about human impact, but it'd be very welcome to the committee if you could show that actually we were improving things and show with some data as well as words. So,
And noting that within those regions, of course, there is, a whole range of nationalities that may be processed at that post because they happen to be residing in that particular region. So it would be a more detailed breakdown to provide that assistance, which we're happy to provide.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. You've outlined, I think, some improvements in your submission, or touched on maybe earlier in the discussion, to client engagement and information. In the interest of time, can you just take that on notice and maybe just give us a little bit more information, if there's anything in addition to the submission, because that was a few months ago, that you could give us, and then if we've got further questions, we can come back to you. Sure. We're not going to finish at 5, but I'll try to sort of,
I thought we were going to 6. So.
Well, we're going to aim to finish well before 6. I said at the absolute latest. That would be good, wouldn't it?
We're aiming for 5:30.
We're aiming for 5:30.
Hint too?
Yeah, I'll do my best. Thank you for your forbearance. I told you I'll put the politics up front so we can just, get the evidence. There we go. Had a deal. The settlement support for partner visas, it's a policy question, but I'm curious in terms of your thinking around the program, whether the Audit Office saw any evidence. Our current approach, as I understand it, is you get a partner visa and there you are.
I'd point out there's been a big expansion in access to the English language programs. So English language is a significant part of settlement, so I wouldn't disregard that. But a partner visa is not a visa that attracts, if you like, the typical settlement support that is provided to humanitarian entrants.
Is it an issue in the Department's administration of the program that you'd watch who's receiving visas? And I'll use the example of the MD80 cases that I touched on in my homily. You might say rant, we'll say homily earlier, that one of the things which is deeply disturbing me and our community support agencies, if I go to any of the emergency relief centres, any of the community info centres, any of the social support services around southeast Melbourne, over 50% of their caseloads are Afghans. Either they've arrived on partner visas in the last year or two, and they're not getting the settlement support beyond, well, you can go to English, but nothing else happens, or they're people who've come off the 12-month, HSP program and they still need more support because they've got trauma or whatever reason. Is this something which the department would routinely analyse the settlement impacts and at least provide advice to government on options to deal with it? Because I know, and I'm sure it's the same in other parts of Australia, but we're not coping.
When you say analyse, I think the feedback mechanisms we have is an expanded community liaison officer network, if you like, the multicultural affairs function in the department. We also have government has work going on in respect to the multicultural framework as well. So there is work in that regard, which is not the specific, very, very specialised settlement support for humanitarian entrants, but it is work to support the community in respect of multicultural communities in particular, but also Australia's social cohesion more broadly. So that work is underway. I'd make the point, though, that the more if there were decisions to provide additional settlement support, similar to what refugees receive, that of course increases the cost in respect of the partner program, and that would have to be a factor that would be balanced.
Yeah. Okay.
The other point is that by its nature, a partner visa does have an individual supporter. I appreciate there's more to it than that, but it is different from a humanitarian entrant who is literally arriving without anyone to support them in many cases. There's a partner there who does bear some of that support role.
Chair, we're doing an audit at the moment of the adult migrant English program as well.
And so when someone sponsors, so a sponsor in Australia sponsors a person overseas, the department collects and the sponsor receives a pretty vast range of information about them: criminal backgrounds, health checks, identity checks, police checks, security stuff. There's a fair bit of information. One of the issues that I've observed in practice, and I'm just curious, it came up in the Senate inquiry in dowry abuse, which, despite my meeting with Christian Porter twice and others, the former government just never responded to, but I think we've close to have tabled a response if we haven't already. One of the issues which we dealt with there was the information asymmetry, and it goes to particularly prospective marriage visas, the 300, arranged marriages, which are a dominant part of culture in South Asia in particular, where there's horrific cases of family violence and exploitation because, let's say, I'm a guy in Melbourne, permanent resident, I've won the lottery. I then effectively command a dowry of $100,000 or $200,000, which a vulnerable woman's family pays, thinking they've won the Willy Wonka golden ticket, life in Australia. And I say that, I'm an engineer and I've got this much money in the bank and I've got this education. She gets here and finds, I smoke pot 3 days a week and I've never finished university, and I occasionally, when my car's not banged up and I've got money for petrol, drive an Uber, and I lock her in the house and abuse her, extort more dowry and send her home and do it again. Have we given any thought to those exploitation aspects in the program and whether we could remedy some of this by simply using the sponsor lever to require information?
In terms of the issue you raise,
it's a big problem.
Obviously it's a significant concern, and some of that was drawn out in the inquiry you mentioned. I might ask Jody to expand on...
Because that was getting on 5 years ago?
In the last
Have we thought about it?
2 or 3 years, we've expanded. We have a family domestic violence network. I might ask Jody to talk.
But there's a specific question in there. Mm-hmm. We collect all the information on this person. Yep. Why would the person being sponsored, why would we not at least... Because it doesn't increase your regulatory burden, you're not vetting it, you're simply requiring someone sponsored to also do the criminal check and bank account statement and stuff and pass it back. And if you later prove to have lied, then you've committed an offence. There's no regulatory burden.
I might get Jody to talk to that one as well, if you can.
Just firstly on the domestic family violence, if I may, and then I might seek advice from Mr Noble on that second question. The department has commenced a dedicated domestic family violence support section within the family visa branch, which basically is a mechanism by which now the department has a referral mechanism into the department, and our clients can come to us with concerns about the situation that they're in, and it's a service by which we have representatives out in the states and territories working in partnership with the community liaison officers to support a pathway or an outcome for people who find themselves in those dreadful circumstances. And there is also a lot of work with regards to those domestic family violence provisions, which are currently attributed to the partner visa caseload and one of the bespoke visa class. The department is currently in the process of expanding those provisions into, I think, approximately 25 other visa programs, which will pick up clients who may find themselves in those circumstances, say in like a skilled program, and are experiencing domestic family violence as a secondary applicant. There would be then a pathway for them to be able to stay in Australia as a permanent resident if required. So that work's been underway since July 2021 and has been expanding during that period of time. To your second question, I might see if Mr Noble has any further insights on that one that might assist.
Thank you, Jodie. Thanks, Chair. There are some provisions in our sponsorship framework in terms of character issues, and there's certain situations where we can request those police certificates and broader criminal histories, if it exists in sponsorship, to make some of those assessments around, obviously, the vulnerable applicant who might be with that sponsor. I can take on notice the particulars there and provide the committee the exact detail.
I'll just raise one other specific question, and then it goes to a general point I put to the Audit Office and to the Department about what our policy analysis of the impacts of the family programs are, because it seems to be underdeveloped and a bit ad hoc. You know, we put a lot of effort into looking at vulnerable worker exploitation on student visas or temporary skilled visas, but I haven't detected anything in the audit or in my interactions over some years that we also put a structured, sustained effort into thinking about the policy impacts of the partner visa program on the Australian community, be they things we care about, exploitation. We're doing some stuff on family violence now, but also social cohesion issues in the longer term. And so the other example I'd just raise, some years ago when I was on a field trip with, I think, the member for Latrobe, and we met with the UK Home Office for some hours. I think it was called it Jason's Magical Mystery Tour of the World on gangs. He was on about African gangs or something, but it was a fascinating conversation. Indeed, it was a fascinating conversation talking about the settlement impacts of partners, and it led to quite a controversial decision in the UK that they had to impose an English language test on partner visas or permanent partner visas. Now, I'm not suggesting that here before anyone think it's very controversial. But I use it as an example, and the reason they did that was they looked at the second, third and fourth generation impacts of certain former Commonwealth countries where they'd established, effectively they'd colonised the northern mill towns, and the culture developed over 3 or 4 generations that there was almost no intermarriage and no intermingling with the community. They'd just go and get a prospective marriage visa from the home country, and it was actually became a breeding ground for radicalisation and terrorism and family violence, because there was the partner visa program there, in effect, was facilitating this outcome over generations. What's our policy, what's our structured way of thinking about year to year the societal impacts of the partner visa program and these issues? Because, you know, some would say that we've got some seeds of similar issues.
There are some elements I could point to in terms of looking at. We've conducted a longitudinal study in respect of different migrant cohorts, and looking at those cohorts, it tends to look at, it includes partners, but it tends to look at elements like employment and the nature of employment. It does touch on English levels as well. That feedback is what went into decisions around expanding the AMET program. So I guess there's a few options available to government when you consider issues like that. One is to mandate a requirement for English in respect of a partner visa.
You don't really want to do that. People fall in love with people.
Another is to make English language acquisition readily available to migrants, because all the literature, as you know, is that strong English leads to strong outcomes in terms of the community and economically. So there's those sort of strands. I'd say we're much better informed in respect of the family and domestic violence issues than we were 3 years ago. The team that Jodie mentioned, which I think Matthew set up actually, have very good connections across the sector in terms of legal support services and shelters and the like in respect of domestic and family violence. So we have a much better picture of what that looks like.
Is there a structured research program, a partnership with a university, like a longitudinal sense? Because I know when I used to run skilled business migration, like this stuff's just normal. You do post-settlement surveys. Any bureaucrat can tell you what percentage of people are employed in their field 3 years after, but this is just I don't know.
We've got. I can take it on notice and draw. I can't point to a particular partnership with the university, but we'll check on that. But we do have that continuous survey that we do, which gives us a picture in respect of partner, but also the skilled caseloads.
And if I could just add, a couple of years ago, and I'd have to check the dates, Chair, but there was a series of consultations with communities and key stakeholders with regards to what if regards English language requirements or enhancing English language for the partner visa program. So there has been some level of testing and engagement and discussion about what would, is that something that would be good, negative, positive, how would that work? And on balance, it was, as Mr. Willard said, access to the AMAP was, the preferred pathway, as opposed to making that a requirement.
And others have suggested, and I'm not suggesting this is my view. I don't support making it a test to come in on the temporary visa, but some have suggested that a very rudimentary English ability, given now the programs there, may be a reasonable requirement for the permanent partner visa grant. The same way we've raised the English language test between the student visa and the graduate visa.
Certainly, Jodie reminds me that the issue has been canvassed previously in terms of consultations around it, and there was a high degree of concern. I guess you'd have to consider the sort of circumstance that could lead to. There are sometimes good reasons why people may not be able to get over an English language threshold despite the fact they have a genuine relationship with an Australian citizen.
Yes.
So what do you do in that circumstance?
There's always exemptions, as there are for the English language test on citizenship.
Yeah, so there's a lot to consider there.
Ultimately, yes, I get that. But anyway, I make the point, if you can take it on notice, the policy issue I'm curious about coming out of the report, policy program design and implementation, back into the big frame, is what structured, permanent, ongoing policy analysis do you do, and impact analysis? So the impact and the performance framework is not just widgets and processing, but the actual outcomes that the program is achieving, not just the fiscal outcomes, but the social outcomes. Auditor-General?
We didn't see any of that type of analysis. The data tended to be more on, as you say, throughputs and issues like that, and there was, as we talk about in the report, there was more analysis from the economic point of view, but very little. Well, we didn't see anything of that type of analysis informing policy.
Yeah, look, it's a reasonable question and something that this inquiry could quite reasonably think about or recommend. If I draw parallels with the conversation we just had on black, shadow economy, it's not just have you done the things in your plan, but what outcomes are you achieving, and are we permanently analysing that?
We'll take it on notice.
Yeah. So just to telegraph, I just want to touch on the old cases reporting issue, figure 3.5, talk a little bit about the AAT and child visas, and then I think we'll probably close. We may need another hearing once we've digested the stuff on notice, but I hope you can see, despite my frustration and reflecting, the citizens, that we're trying to be constructive and appreciate you've made significant improvements in the last 12 months.
Thank you. I'm very happy to
So,
come back.
just on the old cases issue, figure 3.5 on page 59, it was actually, unless I'm misreading it, it was the only point in the report where a chart kind of fessed up that there's this whole bunch of cases which aren't captured in the stats. The percentage of on-hand applications in visa category above 3 years. And I think to the Audit Office, is it a fair distillation of your conclusion? There was no systematic reporting to government. The only measure floating, or even internally within the department to senior management, the only measure floating around was this very crude measure, the percentage of the cases over 3 years. That was it.
Yes, and we've had an opportunity for improvement in terms of improving the reporting on those over 24 months.
Yeah, so I mean, if you were sitting there as a deputy secretary group or an audit committee or the minister, you'd need some more richness of data to understand, well, is this a problem? Why are these cases? How do I understand them? How many have been 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years? How many are MD80 cases? What are the reasons? Have you improved that and addressed that issue?
Yes, I might ask the team to expand on what's been done. I touched on some of the results in terms of the reduction of that age caseload in my opening statement. But yes, all of those elements, how we get the data, how we can slice that data to help us manage the program better, are all things I would say that we've improved considerably in the past couple of years. I think we accepted the recommendation and we haven't finalised implementation, but we have done a number of things in that direction around age cases. But I might ask one of the team to expand on that.
In August last year, following the recommendations from the ANAO, we've developed a dashboard which provides a lot more granular level around the ages of the caseloads. So to the ANAO's point around some of the sort of more high-level age cases, we now have a much more definitive breakdown that we use as a monthly performance management. Yep. These X amount of cases are over 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, etc., etc. So there's quite a detailed dashboard that's been developed from the team, and that's used to really sort of focus our attention and energy on those age cases. And you'll see the results of that, as Mr. Willard stated at the start in his opening statement about the reduction of the age cases, which is not just because of the dashboard, but it's a whole bunch of other reasons. But this really helps in terms of the diagnostics. Yeah, the diagnostics behind it, particularly because we have this unique situation of having new applications and quite older applications on hand.
Yep. We've been doing a lot in respect to program management across all the visa programs and re-establishing that discipline, and that's reflected in the sort of dashboard approach, but it's also about the standards that different programs are meant to meet in respect of not just how many they're doing and how fast, but to what quality they're doing it with. So there's the feeding in our QA process where we're looking at 2% plus of the cases that are decided, doing a better job in terms of looking at what comes from that process and then changing our own business processes to learn from that. All of those things have improved significantly. There's always more to do, though.
In addition, there's probably a couple of things that will be helpful was really a very big focus in immigration programs to develop or professionalise program management, which looks at those really important tools for program managers to be able to, have those diagnostics for the management of the caseloads. And the other one that may be of interest is a dedicated dashboard with regards to the MD-affected Afghan caseload as well.
Yeah, and in some ways I was more interested in the sort of the non-MD80 because that's a thing and you're managing it now as the team and a thing. It's the other ones, and there was a little bit of deja vu from the citizenship audit where I think there was an unusually colourful description of finding piles or files of old cases that had been forgotten in a cadenza. I think we used the word cadenza. Might have been, one of those old things. It was a very uncharacteristically colourful phrase, and it felt like whack-a-mole, like you didn't have enough staff and you were processing the ones you can, but there wasn't even a minute to breathe and turn your minds to, well, hang on, what are the ones left behind?
And that's what we intend to be drawing out with this program management focus.
Can I just ask you about the AAT, and then if we get a sec child visas, and then I think we'll have to reconvene because we'll take stock and breathe and look at your answers. Just on the AAT, there was evidence at table 310 there's a statutory requirement, I think, that Section 352 of the Act requires the Department to forward the decision record of a case lodged with the AAT to the AAT within 10 working days. And yet there's a table showing that there were 11 family visa cases that were more than 1,000 days overdue, which is bizarre, and there were 66 files in total overdue. Have you fixed that system, and how can a case be 1,000 days overdue to the court?
I don't have an answer to that second part. I might just ask if we have anything we could provide, or whether we need to take that on notice in respect of the AAT.
In particular, in what was raised in the report, we'll take that on notice to provide a response, but I can assure you, Chair, that we do afford priority to all AAT processes, and I'd be confident there's no systemic issues there.
And then the other AAT question, this comes through my office, and I lost count of the number of letters I used to write to Alex Hawke about it. In the old days, when the AAT made a decision and recommended that a visa be granted and remitted the case for decision, it kind of seemed to used to go to top of the pile because it had probably been hanging around for years. What's the policy and what's the system in place to give some priority or respect to the AAT decisions? Because there were just unbelievable numbers of AAT decisions, at least in the previous term of government. I've lost memory of whether the term before, but at least in the previous term, where the fact the AAT had made a recommendation to grant a visa didn't seem to mean anything.
Generally, they are prioritised.
Is that a formal policy position that, unless there's a reason not to? And I get that occasionally ministers use their character powers, and there's exceptions. But it's still a decision.
A remittal can be a finding that a particular criteria is met, but not that all the criteria are met. So there can be still work to do once a case is remitted. But I think, as a general rule, they are prioritised. But if we're not sure, we can come back on that.
Yeah. If you could just let us know what the formal position is, because it was an issue that I discussed, I think, with Abel Risfi, where he'd also observed that the department used to have a formal understanding, and it was actually an agreement that they could exceed the planning level if it related to just getting the AAT cases done, because that was a courteous thing to do to the court, and no one really minded too much. It seems to pass the common sense test that if the court says, yes, this is straightforward, and you look at it and go, it's straightforward, you just should go to the top of the pile.
Yes, I would agree in broad terms. Can we come back just to make sure that detail's correct?
Can I just on notice, the folders that were found in the credenza or compactus or whatever they were in, what happened to those?
Well, that was the citizenship audit a few years ago.
That was the citizenship audit, okay.
Yes.
We have few credenzas left. I can inform you, Senator. There are still some.
We're going to go and search to see whether
very
you
small
actually said credenza.
Parts of the program that are paper processing, but most of the credenzas. I have to say though, a similar risk exists in terms of if you think of an online credenza. That there's a similar.
Well, that
issue
depends
there.
on your ICT systems, but that's another inquiry we've started, so that'll be great. Look, I think that's enough for now. What we might do, just to telegraph, I haven't got into child visas. There's a bunch of specific things that came up in the audit report that the Secretariat have rightly pointed out to us that we need to collect evidence on. What I might do is go through and see how many of those we can do just by correspondence, because they're things. Let you get the answers back to us, digest them, and we'll probably come back. It might be a couple of months by the time we get the answers, digest them, find diary time. But I think it'd be good to have a further discussion, because I'm really keen to try and think what constructively we can say and do, and also recognise the fact that you have improved. 600 new staff would do something.
Thank you. The team are very happy
Thank
to hear
you.
your feedback.
Yeah, and look, thank you for the improvements on behalf of the humans out there.
It is very helpful.